Hello, and welcome to our news literacy program, How Do You Get Your News? We Found Out. My name is Beth Conrad, and I'm the Journalism Program Director here at Loyola University Chicago. I'm also the faculty advisor to our Loyola student chapter of SPJ, the Society of Professional Journalists. News literacy is a critical issue for our nation and for the future of journalism. How do college students define news? How do they consume news? And who do they trust for their news? Well, what better way to find some answers and insights than to ask 500 college students in the nation's third largest city and major market, Chicago. Our Loyola chapter spent 6 months on this project, conducting one-on-one interviews with 500 students. Our SBJ students were trained how to conduct the interviews to avoid any bias or leading questions. We used a standardized set of questions assembled with the help from our PR and marketing faculty to assure neutrality and fairness. Well, now we want to present the results and get some reaction from working professional journalists. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderators and hosts for this program, our student president, Samantha Sartori, and chapter executive board member, Grace Runkle.
Thank you, Professor Conrad. Before we go ahead and release our survey results, we wanted to introduce our distinguished panelists. First on the end, we have Mary Wisniewski. She's a national correspondent for Thomson Reuters at the Chicago Bureau, and she's the current president of the Chicago Headline Club, which is the nation's largest SPJ pro chapter, representing more than 350 Chicago journalists. Prior to working for Reuters, Mary covered business for the Chicago Sun-Times, and before that, she worked at the Chicago Lawyer, where she won the Herman Kogan Award for Public Service Legal Reporting for a series on the federal sentencing guidelines. Next to Mary, we have Professor Rochelle Rogers, who is a professor here at Loyola School of Communication. She came to us from ABC News as an award-winning producer working with both Ted Koppel of ABC Nightline and the late Peter Jennings of ABC News. Rogers was also the editorial producer for CNN and its Washington, D.C. bureau. She's produced several overseas news reports with distinction. Along with her CNN colleagues, she's the recipient of 2 Peabody Awards, a DuPont Award, and the David Bloom Award for her news producing.
All right, and next we have David Schaefer, who is the NPR National Desk Correspondent for the Midwest, based here in Chicago. He has covered a range of stories, including educational pieces on No Child Left Behind, national disasters, and profiles on service members killed in Iraq. Before NPR, Schaefer was an award-winning reporter, editor, and fill-in news anchor for Chicago's WBEZ-FM. He did in-depth reporting on educational issues regarding Chicago public schools. And then joining us on Skype, we have Don Wycliffe, who serves on the board of directors at the McCormick Foundation and is a former Loyola journalism professor. Prior to teaching at the School of Communication, Wycliffe spent 35 years in the newspaper industry and worked as the editorial page editor and the public editor at the Chicago Tribune. In 1996, Wycliffe was a Pulitzer finalist for his work at the paper. Before that, he spent 5 years as an editorial writer at the New York Times.
So thank you to all of our panelists. So why we're all here tonight. In October, the Association for Journalism and Mass Communication held the National News Engagement Day, encouraging people to get involved with news, whether it's tweeting it, reading it, any sort of way getting news. So we were curious to see, how are college students going about and getting their news? What sources do they find credible? Where are they going to getting it? What devices are they going to? So we decided to survey them. So for a week in October, we surveyed over 500 Loyola students on both campuses to see how they get their news. So Grace is going to go over the demographics of the survey.
So a major concern we had was making sure we had an accurate representation of the student body at Loyola. So after we evaluated our results, we found that 80% of our responses came from the Lakeshore campus, and about 20% came from the Water Tower campus right here. So that's a fairly accurate breakdown of the students at Loyola. And looking at the gender breakdown, about 70% of the responses were from females, about 30 were from males, and for those of you who know the gender demographic at Loyola, that is a very accurate representation. We also had a very nice breakdown of the ages. The majority were from students ages 18 to 24. And then when we looked at our majors, we also had a very nice breakdown as well. Biology, psychology, ad PR and business were the top majors that we had responses from, and those are the most popular majors at Loyola.
Yeah, and as you can see, the breakdown, most of our majors fell into the College of Arts and Sciences. All right. So our first survey question, we asked, how often do you get the news? And we were happy to see that over 50%, 56% of students said they get it on a daily basis. And then after that, 26% said weekly, and 2% said multiple times a week. So for the majority of students, they are getting news regularly. There are a couple people who said seldom or never, so that was a little heartbreaking for us. Our second question was, how do you get your news? And as expected, we saw that most students are going to online news services or social media to get their news, which fell above what you hoped they were going to as print, radio, and television, the big three. So those all fell under word of mouth, which we were talking about earlier, which was kind of interesting that more people are hearing their news from their friends or their family as opposed to going to a source.
So then we wanted to find out what devices or how the students were getting their news. And it's no surprise that computers, laptops, phones, and apps were our top responses. Almost 450 of our responses said that they access news on computers, and phones and apps were at just over 350. So that did not surprise us at all. And then when we looked at which devices they preferred to get their news from, again, we were not shocked at all by computers and phones being the top responses. We were a little shocked that we did have so many television responses, even though it's not a lot. We were talking about this before. We know that we go online for most of our news, so we were shocked to see how many people responded with TV. Also, radio was the lowest response, but that didn't really surprise us. Maybe if we were on a campus where people drove more often and didn't take as many at the shuttle or public transportation, we might have more people looking at radio for their news.
One of the biggest questions we had was, how do they define news? And so we asked the question in a brief statement or a couple of words, how do you define news? And with 500 responses, it was kind of hard to group them, but these were the biggest categories that they fell under. So most students said news is some type of current event or what's happening in the world. And then after that, students said information and facts, and then taking place in the world or global. So those are kind of the general categories we could place everything under. People also said public or people. We had students who mentioned media specific, and then some other interesting responses.
Bring out the point that all these interviews were conducted one-on-one. It wasn't a paper survey.
So when we asked them this question, these were some of the most interesting responses we came across. People defining news as northeast, west, and south, boring, war, non-educational and pointless unless it's Fox or WGN. As former WGN intern, I thought that one was funny. The happenings, accurate sometimes. So we came across, and those were what we thought were the most interesting responses. We did get some great responses. People said news was the lifeline between the public and the media.
We had a lot of responses that talked about current events was one of the most used terms, and a lot of things talked about connecting global issues and local issues, and a lot of things about educating people. So.
And then our final question on the survey was, what news source or organization do you find the most credible? You may name more than one. Now with this question, we did not want to give any bias. So if people said, well, what do you mean by news source or organization? We said, whatever you think. Because we did not want to say, oh, well, like the New York Times or CNN, because that is putting in our bias, so we let them go. And as I noticed when I was doing surveys, a lot of people were saying CNN. And our other surveyors noticed this as well, because CNN was our top.
Yes, by far CNN was the most popular response. Following that, there's a bit of a gap, but the next two most answered organizations were the BBC and the New York Times. And then after that, we had a whole range of different sources, but those were the three names we saw over and over again throughout the survey.
We also did, they're not listed on there, but we did get some interesting responses. Some students named comedy news, such as The Daily Show or The Colbert Report, as their most credible news sources. Reuters was on there as well. 5 people mentioned Reuters, so. Which we were actually impressed because as a journalism student, I read Reuters all the time, but I don't know if usual students go to that as a regular source, so that's something we'll be interested in hearing about. So now we'll get into our panelists, and we'll start with Mary on the end and get their initial reactions on our survey results.
Well, I was very encouraged by the results, especially the small number of seldoms and nevers for people not looking at the news. And I wonder if, because you think of college students as very burrowed into what they're doing and maybe not looking up so much. I know that was that way when I was in college, and I think that the ubiquity of online resources, everyone having cell phones and stuff like that, might be contributing to that, because 20, 30 years ago when you were in college, you actively had to subscribe to a newspaper. You actively had to go to the student lounge and look at the television in order to get news, and everyone has news in their pocket right now. And so I think that that maybe online isn't such a bad thing after all us print people, if people are able to get their news much more easily than they used to, whatever kind of life situation they're in. One of the things I'm curious, and I was also impressed by the sources, BBC and the New York Times and the CNN. Those aren't bad. One thing that I worry about with the people getting their news online is the lack of this smorgasbord quality of newspapers. You can open a newspaper and there's the sports and there's the international and there's the national and there's whatever Dear Abby says and what's going on in the comics, and you can get a very wide variety of views of the world. And one of the things I worry about with getting everything online is that you might just be looking at things that you're interested in, or that your friends are interested in, because they're the ones that are forwarding the stories for you. And I think that that might be a problem in not being exposed to a wider variety of material. And so those are my initial responses.
Thanks, Mary. Rochelle?
Hi. Well, first I just want to applaud Professor Conrad and SPJ just for having the foresight to conduct such an interesting study. I guess what really stood out to me was just the definition of news and how it's becoming more and more ill-defined, which I just find very interesting. I mean, when I was in college, I always understood news to mean very important events. But looking at the study today, there were all sorts of words I normally wouldn't associate with news. That's how students define news, which I think is fascinating. It's not surprising that CNN is a very popular online source for students. I'm surprised that Twitter's not more prominent in your study.
Twitter was listed on there. I think maybe like 6 or 8 times people referenced Twitter.
Okay, that's all right. Okay, that's good. And I think that you raised a very good point about online news and your concerns, because I think accuracy is something that's really big with having so much access to information, and then how do students kind of differentiate between what's true and what's not, and therefore what's news and what isn't. There was a study about a couple of years ago, maybe a year ago, about who do students trust, or who do people trust as their main news anchor. And a lot of people, I was expecting to hear Brian Williams or David Muir, and people said Jon Stewart. So I'm just surprised that Comedy Central isn't more prominent in your study as well, because a lot of students get their news from Comedy Central. I also want to take into account with your results that there's something that's happening with students and how they get their news. They don't really watch it on one device. The new 2-screen minimum is very prominent with students, and students like to look at television and then also look at, they're also on their phones, so they're getting news in a very different way than how I grew up. So it's all very interesting.
Great. David?
Well, I too applaud you for taking on this survey, and I think it's really important, and we could get more into news literacy a little bit later, but that our universities are actively engaging citizens beyond the classroom, students as citizens, to get involved in their communities and know what's going on around them. I mean, that's really important, and I think too many of us walk around with our heads kind of down and not paying attention to the world around us. But a couple things I was really not surprised to see the number of students responding that they're getting most of their news from their devices, especially the smartphones. I was surprised to see actually so many mention print, because I didn't know there was print really much anymore. And I'm assuming that they mean things like the Phoenix and maybe catching the Sun-Times or red eye at the CTA stations and things like that. I was disappointed but not surprised to see radios so low because it's just not, unless you're driving, it's not a primary vehicle for delivering news. I think for a lot of people, I don't even know if you can even buy a device, I mean, other than going out of your way on your phone and downloading an app for our local station, WBEZ or NPR.org. I think you really have to go out of your way to get news in that way. So those sorts of things didn't surprise me. I was surprised at how many people, 26% saying they only got their news weekly. And I think a lot of people don't know how often they're really getting news. And news, again, the loose definition and the kind of crazy definitions that some people came up with for news were a little surprising. But really, if you know it's going to be below zero tonight, you're kind of paying attention to the news. You're getting news. If you know that the Bears management, talked for the first time in a month about what they're looking for in the draft and what they're doing, I mean, that's sports news, but it's still news. If you know that there's been a shooting in your neighborhood or that the CTA is running slow, you're catching news. And I do feel like people probably know at least a little bit, headlines, more than they think they do, because there's so many different platforms and there's so many different ways of delivering it. The word of mouth surprised me a little bit as well. And I wonder if that's really word of mouth or if it's actually a friend of mine posted this on Facebook, or a friend of mine saw this in some of the different ways of translating that, and the accuracy of the information, I think, is important to understand as well. But a really good survey, and encouraging that so many students are really actively engaged in knowing what's going on in the world around them.
And to Don?
Thank you. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, but anyway, I was surprised by several aspects of the survey. Probably the biggest surprise was in the choices of news organizations or news services that students indicated. All of the top 10 or so are fairly traditional news organizations, and I guess I betray my bias when I say I think that's a healthy thing. These are organizations that, while they may not always succeed at it, they at least profess to engage in the discipline of verification, which is the essence of journalism. And so that is, if not a guarantee, then provides good odds that the information the reader or hearer or viewer receives is going to be accurate. I was particularly surprised to see in second and third place the BBC and the New York Times. I kind of expected it would be more electronic stuff. CNN is not what it used to be, but it's still a pretty good news organization. I was frankly troubled by some of the definitions of news. I wonder what it means when someone says it's not fun unless it's Fox or WGN. I'm not sure what that means. And I also wonder how one gets news by word of mouth. Was the third place choice among devices for getting news. I've never understood that, although I've heard it before. So that's my initial take.
Great. All right, so my next question for the panelists is, now that you've seen our data that we collected, how big of a concern do you think news literacy is in our country? And Mary?
I think it's a huge concern because I think our democracy is being threatened by lack of appropriate information. And I think it's being threatened by a lot of things. It's being threatened by money in politics. It's being threatened by people not being able to run for office unless they have $1 billion. But the only way we can stave off the threats to democracy is by being well informed. And if you don't know how to judge whether a news story is reliable or not, you don't have that power. You don't have that information. And I worry that with the glut of news information we have coming from all sides, I worry about people being able to sort out what they need to know. And I think that in order to preserve our democracy, this is something that's just going to have to be taught. I thought it was something people already knew, but but I guess they don't. And I think it has to be taught early, the way we used to be taught in grade school how to judge whether or not advertisements were real. I think we need to do that for news as well.
All right. Thank you. Rochelle?
Well, I think there are several considerations. First, I think the students are very different. They're growing up in a very interesting time, in a very interesting tech culture and digital culture. I think students are now, I like to call it like the read-write culture, where students can not only consume news but also produce it. So they're making these very difficult transitions from content consumers to content creators, and it's affecting the way that they see news. So I think that media literacy is very, very important. As a producer of news. I also think that news is so hard to not only consume but understand, because students have such a wide access. They have tons of access to tons of information. So just how to discern and just have really good news judgment about what's news and what isn't is key. And I think going back to the study, the fact that you had so many different definitions kind of makes it all the more important that students understand the difference.
Thank you. David?
I think news literacy is vital. I think it's so important. And I really thought, especially in reading some of the responses that people gave in their definitions of news, that they're missing the mark of what news is. I just said that I think people are getting a lot more news, quote unquote news, than they realize, because they know what's coming in the weather, and they know what's been happening in sports, and they know I think news literacy is not just knowing what's going on and the big headlines that have happened in town or around the world. I think it's an understanding of what this means to me and an understanding of why this is important. I think so much of what we're getting in news, in whatever platform it is so entertainment based. It's so gossip based. It's there's the lack of fact checking on certain things. Tweets are going out without being checked out beforehand. Big news organizations are often having to pull back on things that they're tweeting out. We've done it before. I know there's a few things that just happened recently. So I think we have a great responsibility in making sure that we're delivering news in, yes, a digestible format and something that people can access easily and understand easily. And yes, we can't drone on in our long form stories necessarily in the way we used to. We need to captivate and engage, but we have to find more and better ways to convey the importance and the urgency and the vitality of information. We have a city election coming up next week, and I really don't know how many students who took this poll are going to vote. And my guess would be fewer than 20%, maybe as few as 10%. Maybe many of them aren't actual citizens and registered to vote in Chicago because they have home addresses that are outside of the city, but still, this is an important thing that will affect everyone who lives in this city for the next 4 years. And if you're not engaged and informed and really understanding what's going on, the flip side of this is that I've seen more manipulation of the news by those in charge than I think I've ever seen in my career recently. There is so much messaging and control of messaging and lack of access. We're seeing it with the Rauner administration and what they're doing in terms of what journalists can be at certain events, student journalists being prohibited from news conferences and other events, certain journalists not being able to get in to watch inaugural festivities and things like that. Mayor Emanuel has been much more tightly controlled than any previous mayor, even Daley. So these types of things are big concerns, and I think everybody needs to understand news literacy to know why that matters.
Thank you.
Michelle.
I just want to make a quick point because I think you brought up a really good point. And also just understanding, now you have all these websites like BuzzFeed that repurpose content from the New York Times, from the Post. So it's like, I don't know if even students realize like what's happening and the level of manipulation that's happening online.
Well, even I noticed how low Reuters got a higher mark than the Associated Press, and I know that even much of what's going in the newspapers and a lot of stuff that goes on our site is from Reuters and the Associated Press, and I wonder how much people really know that that's not a necessarily original content, but edited and refed, and sometimes sanitized a little bit.
All right. Don, what do you think about the question?
Well, it's of enormous importance nowadays, given in particular the fragmentation of the media, the fact that the digital age has allowed anyone to become a publisher, and so the need to be able to discern what's true, what's credible, what deserves your attention, what deserves to be thrown in the wastebasket is greater than ever. And it requires a diligence, critical thinking, and a decision really to trust people who deserve your trust. There's a reason some news organizations have endured for decades. And it's probably because they have earned a measure of trust in our society. And so, this issue of news literacy is one of the top 2 or 3 most important in journalism nowadays, I do believe.
All right, thank you.
Right, we wanted to now open it up to the audience for any questions that you may have for our panelists. So, Grace has them.
Yeah, and if you have a question, could you please identify yourself and tell us where you're from?
My name's Liz Grivey, and I'm a senior here at Loyola, and I'm from Batavia, Illinois. So, as Don mentioned, a big thing that comes up a lot is trust for the media. How do young journalists start to repair some of the damage? A lot of people don't trust journalists, so where do we go in the future from here?
I think one place to start is to be trustworthy. Don't do stories that just have one source. Don't do a story in which you allege this enormous conspiracy, but you don't talk to the other side, as recently happened with the Rolling Stone story. Make them worthy of your trust. And I also think that educating other people. If you're a journalism student and you know how journalism works, talk about it. Make it the liturgy. Make it news liturgy. This is how journalism works. You just posted an Onion story on your Facebook page and thought it was real. Why did you do that? Why are you spreading junk? I think you can, be an evangelist for news and how real news works. And it's not, one person spewing off about something. It's actual verification of facts.
I think one of the greatest tools any journalist can have doesn't involve their fingers typing, doesn't involve their pen, it involves their ears, and it's listening to other people. And I think one of the ways you gain trust of sources, of people who just want to know if you're worthwhile is when you listen to them and you listen to their concerns. And I think the other thing is Mary alluded to, is really doing your homework, and you've got to double check things and triple check things. The old city news adage that has been around the city of Chicago forever in journalism was, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. And it's something a lot of us have tried very hard to live by. Gets more and more difficult in the need to instantly try to get those stories out there, but it's really important that we do our homework and we make sure that we're delivering information that is trustworthy.
I would just add, I agree with everything you both said. Just being credible and being informed and aware is the best thing you can do.
May I add one thing? Appreciate good editing. One of the observations that was made during the Brian Louis episode of the last few weeks was that nobody in his newsroom questioned Brian Williams. I was a journalist for many years. I guess I still like to fancy myself one, and it scares the devil out of me to write without an editor. Don't ever get so confident, don't ever get so big that you don't want to be edited, because they'll save your life.
Could I just add something to that? To Don's point, I think collaboration, to always ask and to be honest with yourself and know when you need help, or if you're not sure about something, just not to be afraid. You know, I worked for Ted Koppel for many years, and Don, lots of producers, including myself, were very honest with Ted, and he encouraged that. So I know he's probably one of the few, but I just want to say for the record that Ted was the exact opposite. And we would have these long meetings, actually before Ted would go on the air, about different stories and whether or not that story should run versus another story and what Ted should lead with. So it was always a collaborative setting. Yeah.
He's a smart journalist.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, we have another audience. Introduce yourself. Just right.
My name is Megan Dewey. I'm a freshman journalism student from San Antonio, Texas. My question is, how do you all feel about BuzzFeed and websites like that and how they affect news literacy itself?
Before we start, can I say BuzzFeed, about 5 or 6 students did name BuzzFeed as their most credible source, which we were shocked that number wasn't initially higher, so.
I do think that a lot of people know that it is, for lack of a better word, regurgitated information. I don't necessarily have too much of a problem with it, unless it hasn't been thoroughly checked out before, and I think that's the problem that a lot of these services get into in their effort to just generate clicks, that they just want to put something that's sexy and that's fun, or that's really has a great headline out there, without it being too terribly meaningful, or without it having been too thoroughly fact-checked. But I do think that if it's getting more information and meaningful information out there, the more platforms, the better, I guess.
Yeah, BuzzFeed is, I have mixed feelings about BuzzFeed. I think that they are changing how students and how millennials receive news, and they're on the radar of the New York Times and Washington Post. I mean, they have discussions about BuzzFeed in their editorial meetings, so they're doing something right. But that said, I do think they engage in a lot of clickbait, which is just getting students to come, or not students, just an audience in general, to just click on a story and then to hopefully to read it. So that I'm not too fond of. But BuzzFeed raises an interesting question, which is, what does a successful news story look like? Is it a good lead? Is it a good title? Is it a good picture? Is it a good video? So that I think that they're interesting in the digital space.
I don't really have a problem with BuzzFeed per se, but I think the kind of stories that it gets, it's the same kind of stories that everyone else is going for. If any of you have seen the great movie His Girl Friday, which you should if you're a journalism student, Cary Grant is trying to decide what to take off the front page in order to put on this new breaking story. He had to get rid of the war, get rid of Europe, leave the rooster story. And that's human interest, which is great, but everyone loves a rooster story. But the problem with places like BuzzFeed is it's all rooster stories. It's all stories about junk and cats and zombie cats, and
but they'll argue
I got that story. We helped get that story.
But they'll argue that's what people want to
that's
read.
That's what people
will click on. So
and it's kind of always what they wanted to read. But I think that part of literacy, part of being an informed citizen, is to resist always reading the rooster story, and go to different forms of news, or we won't be informed citizens.
Another service that's out there is Huffington Post, and HuffPost does have their own journalists developing their own content. They do also recycle a lot of things or repost things that are from other sources. But it's interesting because even today I was clicking on a story that was something in depth about, I think it was the governor's budget, and they do have local journalists too, and Anyway, the whole side was all entertainment and gossipy things, Kardashians, and just, it was really, thinking about coming here tonight, I was thinking about, boy, that's really, there was nothing that really related to the article that I wanted to, or took something I was reading here to another level, something that was happening in another state, or linking to here's what's happening in Kentucky or along these lines, or Missouri, or New York, or any. It was just really frustrating to me as a journalist to see nothing but the salacious stuff, the clickbait, and not depth.
Don, any comments on BuzzFeed or organizations like it?
I would just say, beware of any organization that feeds you nothing but dessert.
Great.
Make you eat a balanced
Great.
meal and make you eat your
Broccoli.
spinach. Eat your spinach and then have a little bit of dessert. That's what BuzzFeed is.
Okay, Sam, we have another question.
Hi, my name is Esther Castillejo, and I'm a senior here at Loyola. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Loyola's newspaper, The Phoenix. My question is, because a lot of the organizations that give us our spinach and our nutrients are downsizing or are being criticized for focusing too much, how can this organization still attract audiences but also give them what they need to hear, not just what they want? Because at the end of the day, journalism, as sad as it may sound, it's also a business. And I've asked this question before, and they said, it's like, well, we need to feed you a lot of MH370 before we can feed you Ukraine, in the case of CNN. It's like, how do you find the balance when you're dying to get readers, but you also want to give them good content?
I think this is something that the newsrooms are struggling with all over the country. The New York Times released earlier this year an innovation report about this very topic. It was 100 pages, and it basically looked at why are we losing readership, and how can we gain readership online. And so, I mean, it's a very important question. I think one thing that CNN does well, at least when I was there, was CNN has, 24 hours they're producing content. They're just turning it out. So they're always pushing everything online, even before it hits the air. Everything is going online. So it's almost like a news feed, like constantly, up to the minute. And the New York Times is kind of like, every 4 or 5 hours, so there's always a delay. But I know that they have paywalls now, which subscriptions online, but I don't think that's really saving them, and I don't think most newsrooms or news organizations rely on that for revenue. So it's something that they're still trying to figure out, at least I think the big ones, the Post, the New York Times, LA Times, and they're also cutting back in their newsrooms as well. So it's a delicate balance.
It is a delicate balance, and we have a model that asks people if they like it, if they appreciate the fact that they're getting some broccoli, help us pay for it. And it actually is working. Everything that we provide is out there, it's free. You turn on your local NPR station and it's there. And a couple times a year they'll ask for donations to help cover their costs. More and more of that is being done digitally. There is the underwriting announcements that are the public broadcasting version of ads, which do generate a significant source of revenue. And there are other grants and foundations and things like that that support the efforts that we do. But it is a tricky balance. The question is not just how do you get people to eat their broccoli or eat their spinach and digest the important news that they need to know, because it's not clickbait, because it's not fun and sexy right off the bat. But the other thing is, how do you get people to pay for it? And it's something that a lot of us struggle with in trying to find that balance. We have a model that sort of works, but we haven't been immune to cutbacks too. I mean, we just went through a large number of buyouts and layoffs in the last couple of years. So it's a constant struggle. We've gone to a new clock. Some people have noticed, some people may not have. Our stories are shorter now. And we're trying to augment with the on-air content more digital frills, if you will, more depth, more photographs more, graphs more, graphics, those sorts of things. So, but it's a delicate balance, and there's no easy answer to that question.
I don't know. I hope we're not doomed. No, I shouldn't say that. I think that this has always been this way, really. And you go back to 1900 and look in a newspaper, there's all sorts of junk in it. And a lot of people were just reading that part or looking for the racing results. I think the way to get people into important stories is to tell a good story, which is something that NPR does so wonderfully. I'm in the car listening. I had no idea I was interested in whatever country you were talking about. And then there was a good story coming out, and suddenly I was fascinated and wanted to know more. So I think that'll help if we continue to focus on trying to tell really good stories. And hope and pray that we can get through this transitional period.
I'm sorry, but I couldn't catch the question initially, so I've been kind of...
How can news organizations kind of keep up with getting consumers and providing them with the desserts, like you said, but then also making sure they're getting their spinach and the important stories that they need to hear, while also maintaining the audience with the entertainment news?
I guess my reaction is it's probably a mistake nowadays to look for your whole news diet to any one news organization. So, in effect, the reader, the viewer, the consumer of news has to become his or her own editor and select from the entire range of media voices out there and be judicious in doing so. One could at one time, depend on going to the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or some other news organization, some other reputable news organization, and getting on page one a decent representation of what the important events of the day were, and maybe a little lagniappe, a little dessert somewhere on that front page. But now you've got to create your own front page in your own way. And admittedly, traditional mainstream news organizations, the ones that engage in the discipline of verification, are financially, in many cases, struggling or on the ropes. But there's still a wide range of well-produced news out there. And you have to exercise judgment and find those and create your own diet.
All right, how about some other questions? All right.
Hi, my name is Ellie Diaz. I'm the secretary of SPJ. As someone who helped conduct these surveys, I think the most interesting, thought-provoking question and the one that took students the most time was the definition of news. So I was going to try and challenge you guys to answer the same question. So in a brief statement or a couple of words, how would you define news?
I think it's both what things that are of concern to the community and things that the community should be concerned about. And when I mean the community, I mean your neighborhood, your school, your house, the world, all of those different communities. So it's not just the things that people want to know about. Like, I'm really concerned about what's going to happen with my team, which is a thing to be concerned about. But also, what should you be concerned about? What's wrong with your water? And so that's a simple one.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think need is the key word here. Important information the public needs to know, not wants to know.
Information, I mean, that is new. I mean, by virtue of the name, it is news. And so I do think that it can't just be historical information and things like that, but it has to be something new, something changing, something interesting. There's also an old adage that dog bites man isn't news, but man bites dog, that is news. So it's something unusual and different. I don't fully necessarily agree with that, but I think it's what informs us as a people, what informs us to be engaged in the decisions that we need to make our lives better, whether that's a different route to work in the morning because the red line has got a delay, or if it's taking an umbrella to work because it's going to rain, or if it's understanding the nuance of a property tax abatement district that is going to maybe cut taxes for some of my neighbors but raise my taxes, or how we're going to adequately fund our schools, and what are we going to feed our kids in our schools, and who's going to pay for all of that. And there's a whole range of things that we need to know to be actively engaged citizens, to have input in the direction of our lives.
Okay. John?
News, definition of news, events and phenomena that touch our common lives, that are public, and that affect our lives as citizens. Frequently these things are not in and of themselves of interest. It is the journalist's job to make the important interesting.
All right, so we have time for one more question. Who would like to have the final question? In the back? This is as far as I can go.
Hello, my name is Lane Hillisland. I'm a sophomore communications student here at Loyola, and I'm from Plainfield, Illinois, which is a very exciting place. My question was, okay, so one of the things that surprised me the most was the response of the most credible news source being CNN. I think that maybe that students might be lying. I mean, I don't know. They might be bluffing. They might not want to admit that it's BuzzFeed, but I mean, why do you think they chose CNN, or do you think that it is actually CNN that they're getting their news from, and BBC in a close second? I mean, like, this is America. They're not even in Britain. So I'm just curious on why those were the top two that students chose. So I'm gonna sit down now.
I think that I wasn't surprised by CNN, because I think people think of CNN when they think of something that's happening right now that's big, like a hurricane or a tornado, which happened in Plainfield. That was a big deal, or something like that. And I agree that I hope that people are paying attention to BBC because they care about the world. I suspect that some of them might have said that because it makes them look smart.
Well, CNN, they have an interesting brand. They're known for breaking news. There was always a joke, well, actually it's not a joke, with our ratings, that our ratings we always trailed Fox until breaking news hit, and then we were always #1. So I think and I think 9/11 had a lot to do with that. So ever since, whenever there's a breaking news event, I mean, people just turn to CNN. It's just their reputation and their brand. So that makes sense.
And I think those sorts of reports, the initial on-the-scene, disaster-oriented things, when you talk about credibility, I think CNN can be counted on for being somewhat credible, pretty credible, in terms of getting the information, although I do get annoyed when I hear people saying, now we can't confirm this, but we've just heard another tornado touchdown, and I'm like, can you wait until you can actually confirm it before you say it? There were a lot of problems, disasters that I've covered in following the lead of the big news organizations that are they do have the tentacles to put themselves on the ground pretty quickly, but some of the misleading information coming first. But that aside, I think CNN has carved itself out in the political spectrum to be pretty centrist, which I think helps with their credibility. They're not to the right as Fox News is, or to the left as MSNBC, or how other news organizations are perceived. I think that just filters in. I think that there was another survey by Pew done recently that also put CNN near the top in terms of credibility. We were a lot higher in that poll than we were the students as well. But so I do think that maybe it's partially just reputation, but I think that the fact that they are able to get on the scene and get real, concrete, important information out there, no matter how overhyped it is about a snowstorm or something like that, it is important to people, and I think that they respect that.
CNN has a lot of resources, a lot. I was actually surprised. They have more resources than the networks do. So, yeah.
And over to Don.
I'd like to commend the questioner for questioning the finding. I don't know that it's not true, but I think that's good journalism that she thought to ask that question.
Yeah.
But I agree with those who said CNN's focus on breaking news and its reputation for getting it to you in timely fashion. And as long as they keep Don Lemon behind curtains, in fairly reliable fashion. MSNBC, they'll preach at you, Fox, they'll propagandize you, but CNN will generally give you fact.
All right, great. Well, we wanted to thank our panelists, Mary Wisniewski, Rochelle Rogers, David Schaefer, and Don Wycliffe for tonight. So let's give them a big round of applause.